Hey, DNA, you may have heard the recent news story about a treatment for Huntington's disease, a progressive and fatal neurodegenerative genetic condition. We are talking to author Lori Jones about her book Spared, a memoir of risk and resolve. She shares what it is like growing up at risk for Huntington's and navigating uncertainty. Lori was absolutely lovely to talk to, and I appreciate her vulnerability on her family dynamics and her honesty about living with the tortured hope. Let's get started. Welcome, Lori. I'm grateful to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You published a memoir, Spared, a memoir of risk and resolve about your experience watching your father descend into the grips of Huntington's disease. And you talk about the uncertainty and secrecy of the disease. And I believe your family referred to it as the shakes. So I was hoping you could maybe first start off by telling us a bit more about Huntington's disease and what it is for those listeners that are unfamiliar.
Absolutely. So Huntington's disease is considered a rare disease. It is a neurodegenerative disorder. It is genetic, inherited from the biological parent, with a 50% risk for each child from that affected parent. So it has a pretty significant inheritance rate, and it is autosomal dominant, regardless of the gender of the parent, and there are no carriers for the disease. It is characterized in a typical progression, which I say typical with air quotes, even though you can't see me doing it, because every case is very different. But a typical progression would involve some psychological symptoms, inhibition loss, various types of psych symptoms, and then followed by choreatic movement, uncontrollable movement of limbs. There's choking and swallowing and movement disorders. Walking is a struggle. And then eventually the person loses control of all of those abilities. So pretty serious. They say only, every case is so serious and in my heart, but 40,000 affected individuals in the United States, although they call HD a family disease because you either have it, you're a family member of someone who does, you're living at risk, or you're caretaking. And so we're talking probably closer to 250,000 people in the United States that are affected in some way by the illness.
Right. And I think one of the things you were saying was that it's not something that you might have that change and you might be at risk, but it's pretty much you kind of have it or you don't. So that's partly why it's so profound. And while the symptoms, some of it can vary, there's kind of like these sort of core things that folks would see, but it's a progression. So it's not one of those things where it necessarily lessens or goes away.
Correct. You don't get better. Now, there might be an ease of symptoms through some medications that are available or some treatments. They always say exercise, diet, and hydration are some of the most important things you can do for many of these neuro illnesses. But you're right. It's degenerative. You're not getting better. There is no cure at this time. There are some medications that can treat some of the symptoms. It is also slow progressing. So, regardless of how the disease manifests in each affected individual, by and large, it's a slow progression, and you could be living with it symptomatic for many, many years.
I think one of the things that struck me in your memoir was talking about the individuals in your family and how different their symptoms were and how not each person kind of wasn't affected the same way. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what Huntington's disease looked like in your family.
Yeah, definitely. And that was part of the confusion. And of course, to date myself and for the listeners, I was born in 1970. So, this is pre-internet. This is this is pre all the things we're doing right now, you and I. Uh, and it was pre-testing. So there was no blood test or saliva test for HD at the time. And so our family did a lot of symptom gathering and talking amongst the family members. My grandmother came from a large family. She had 4 sisters, and there were 3 of the family members that were affected by HD. And of the 3, my grandmother was one of them. She had what I would consider a mild case. She had a tremor. Her faculties were with her as long as I can remember. She had a little difficulty walking, and ultimately it was a swallowing problem that ended her life. She aspirated her food, she got pneumonia, and it was from there. But her sisters Had one who was more of a textbook case, I guess you would say. So I don't know about psych symptoms. We didn't talk about that then, but the psychological tremors and tics and such started in her 40s. She declined and passed away in her 60s. Cared for at home, never entering a care facility. And then the other sister, another great aunt of mine, she was symptomatic before she was 30. She was unable to drive. She went into a long term care facility. And at that point, it was a nursing home. That was the only place that you could go. And she lived there for the remainder of her life. She was bedridden, had to sit in a special chair and just had all of the movements, was nonverbal, unable to care for herself. So, very different progressions and manifestations of the illness amongst all three of the great aunts, which when my father began showing signs and symptoms, his were heavy, heavy psychological, coming out mostly as anger, perseveration, some oddities that would just make you go, something's not right, but I can't put my finger on it. And so my sister and I and our whole family would be thinking, well, Dad, there's something wrong, but is it that? Is it Huntington's? It sure doesn't look like it. And so four very different examples of the disease in my growing up experience made it hard to identify, made it hard to put language to what was happening in our family.
Yeah, because it's interesting that you know this family history, but, through part of the book, there is this sort of like, is this what dad has? Does he have the
Yes.
same thing that, my great aunt has? But there's definitely some lingering questions. And like you said, it was before genetic testing or any types of the things, some assessments that we might do today. You talk a lot about your father and your relationship with your father, and you talk about some of these like mental psychological symptoms that, with your dad there was sort of a right way and a wrong way to do things, or that you had to learn to kind of figure out your dad's rules. And so I was wondering what it was like growing up in that environment where you felt like you had to be careful much of the time.
Yeah, it created a very watchful child, a child who was preventative in nature. I was probably always the one scanning the room. I was reading the room before I could read, uh, to see what the temperature was, how to potentially de-escalate something that might be happening, or how to prevent an outburst. And I think a lot of kids that grow up in a volatile home operate the same way. They grow up as maybe extra watchful adults. They maybe try to carry all of that. It took a long time for me to learn how that the universe wasn't resting on my shoulders as I grew up. But as a young person, and it often worked. That's the other thing. I was sitting with my therapist and she said, but what would happen if you didn't? I said, well, let me tell you. I was really good at keeping the peace in my house. It was a talent that I had. So it created a watchful child, a what if, let's make sure that doesn't happen. The other part of the struggle was the rules changed a lot. And I considered myself a kid who could follow the rules and could get this right. If there was a formula, goodness, I was going to get equals sum. But the rules would change at times depending on his mood. And so that was probably the most difficult aspect was what kind of dad are we going to have today?
Mhm.
The other thing I will say about the uncertainty of the differences in the cases is that there's a piece of you that doesn't want it to be Huntington's. And so it was pretty easy as we were growing up saying, well, surely dad can't have that. It'd be awesome if he didn't. I can remember thinking maybe he has Tourette's, maybe he's just mad. Maybe he's anything but that. And so there's a little bit of that going on as well, I would have to say. Yeah.
I would say I think that makes a lot of sense in trying to figure out, like, we don't want it to be that, so it's potentially something else that's going on that's
Something else would
affecting
be okay.
him.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We'll take
yeah.
it.
When did you realize that what was going on with your dad, wouldn't necessarily get better or wasn't gonna be cured? I don't know if it was necessarily the moment where you found out or kind of accepted it was Huntington's disease, or you kind of realized, "Oh, no, this is how things are going to continue to be."
I think I probably knew in the back of my mind that that must be what it was, probably around later high school years. What I tell people is, if you are in a home with someone who has a situation, and whether it's a neurodegenerative disease or whether it's alcoholism or any kind of mental wellness, in your home, it's all you know. And so you often think, well, this is your father. This is how he acts. This is how he rolls. This is how our family works. It was really only as I started to go outside of the home, or if I was with dad in a community event we went to a ball game or we were out and about and people would stare. Then I would start to think, okay, that walking, that shuffling gait, he almost fell over on the bleachers once. And people, of course, immediately assume that he's on a substance or something's not right. So once you start to see your family member through other people's eyes, it gets real. There's pretty much no denying that this isn't just the way your dad is. So I would say probably high school, definitely college. I was still running away from it though. I thought, well, I can just skate and scoot out of this somehow. And there was no test. He wasn't going to the doctor. He would talk about it. He would say, I might have that, but there's no cure and you just have to live your life. I kind of don't blame him because that was, he wanted to just squeeze every drop out of life. And I think he knew that it was coming. And that was his way of coping at the time.
Yeah, well, and I think like you said, there are maybe some things that can minimize symptoms or potentially help in some respects, but there is not there's not a cure. There's not necessarily something that he could have changed
Yeah, and at that time, there were
potentially.
some trials. I learned now what we didn't know then, and had we been involved in the Huntington's community, and there was one, it wasn't as readily available as it is now. I grew up in a small town. You got a newsletter in the mail, and you didn't have an internet presence where you could log into a group or get to know a community. There were trials, but what we found was that you had to have agreement from the patient to participate in the trial, and he was definitely not going to agree to sign up to be in a trial. There were some medications that were trying to be approved at the time he might have benefited from, but the process was arduous. He wasn't going
Okay.
to sign up.
And what age were you when you realized that you may also have this condition or you were at risk of having Huntington's?
Yeah, so bits and pieces. You hear bits and pieces from your family. I'm starting to piece it together. I'm kind of figuring it out. My grandmother was the most progressive person in our family learning about Huntington's. She signed up for the HDSA newsletter. She followed the Guthrie family and she was very in the know and trying to do her research. She was the one that set me down right before I got married. And she pulled a pedigree chart out of this envelope and it was handwritten. She had her penciled notations and she had filled in the dots of the people that she thought, looking back on their behavior, that she thought might have been affected. And she was piecing it together. And she had shared that with me and sat me down to talk to me about not having biological children. She made her opinion very clear that she felt, you can get married, but you guys should adopt. Like, we need to stop this cycle. And I'll be very honest with you, I didn't want to hear that. I did not want to hear that message from her. It was hard to hear. I have loved my grandmother my whole life. She was a very special person to me, but that day we were not friends. I listened to her talk. I put her notes back in the envelope and I went back to my college town. I didn't want to hear what she had to say. But there was no denying. After looking at her notes, this is probably what he had. He has not been tested or diagnosed formally by a doctor, and he's not going to unless he gets drugged there. Uh, but it was getting pretty real at that point. I would say right right about the time I was going to graduate from college and get married.
And you mentioned, like, at the time, that was not something you wanted to hear or discuss. Was there a time later that it came back and you were like, "Okay, this is something that I need to confront at this point?"
Yeah, we had our first biological child. Dad still hadn't been tested. And then shortly after, a second and a third. And like right between the second and the third, I believe, is when he went into care. So, what got my father into care, unfortunately, was what I tell groups that I speak to about Huntington's an event. And so often people will say to me, well, how do you get your person, your loved one to go to the doctor? Mine won't go. And I said, well, my dad wouldn't go either. And unfortunately, it took an event to put us on the path to getting an answer. And our event was that my dad went to the doctor for an unrelated reason. And while he was at that doctor, and my mother took him, he made a threatening statement about himself and others. And so, of course, the doctor was a mandatory reporter and said, we're going to have to do something about this. We're going to get you into a hold and get you better. Well, my dad immediately saw policemen coming and felt like he was being arrested and he didn't understand and he felt attacked. But it was that event that got him into seeing a geneticist and a neurologist and starting to put together, okay, you have a family history. We haven't heard about this. What's happening? And then to get him tested. So it took a very long time before he was actually tested. And I don't know that he signed up for it. I think it was done as a result of the event. So then we had to face. We had to face, okay, we have the biological children. At that point in 1993 was the first time that blood test became available, presymptomatic genetic testing. I did not want to take that test. And then 6 months later, I would want to. And then I would not want to again. So I would say a person goes around and around on it, trying to decide what they want to do. Yeah.
Yeah, so it wasn't necessarily one clear moment where all of a sudden it was like 100%, I'm all in, this is what we're doing, and there was a lot of back and forth moments. How
Yes.
was it making everyday decisions while carrying this uncertainty? Because I had read that a majority of people who are at risk for Huntington's, don't actually undergo testing. So, like, a lot of these folks are living at risk because they don't do the
Yes.
testing to find out one way or the other. What is that like trying to make some of these decisions and to kind of live in this space of uncertainty?
Yeah. They call it the tortured hope. And I think that's, well, because the possibility of being negative outweighs the daily paranoia of possibly being affected. So you can walk with the daily paranoia of, I might have this. But if you go find out and you get the test and it's positive, if I'm saying this right, you can't unknow that. So I can walk at risk thinking I may or may not. The uncertainty is almost unbearable. However, I will take the uncertainty in exchange for taking that test and possibly being positive. Because then what would I do with that information? When I sat with the geneticist before she revealed the results, she asked one more time, are you sure you want to know this? Because once I tell you, you can't unknow it. And there have been people that have said, never mind. They went through the whole blood draw, all the counseling, and they say, never mind, just hold my results. You can always get them later. Like they'll hold them for you. People who have decided not ready. So yeah, there's a large percentage of people that don't go through testing. They say this is where I'm gonna sit. I'm gonna live at risk.
Do you think that also speaks to potentially maybe the power of hope? Like living with the uncertainty means that you still get to live with this hope as well?
Yes. And then you question yourself. You drop something that day and you think, oh, here it comes. So many. And my cousins said the same thing. When I met with all of them and spoke with them as I was writing the book, and they said, oh, didn't you just, if you forgot something or you said something wrong or you tripped or you dropped a glass or, yep, every one of us just walked with that paranoia. However, do you go and find out? And so people say, well, what finally propelled you from relation to the let's go get tested? And I have to say it was my partner, my husband. He said we need to know so we can have a plan. We have no plan right now, and my life was lived two ways. Lived in a hurry. I wanted to get everything done and in because I thought, what happens if I get sick? I got to go do this. I got to do this. I got to do this. And yet refusing to commit to anything big. So it was a very strange dichotomy of in a hurry and yet refusal to commit because who knows, we don't want to buy a big house. What happens if we can't pay for it? Very odd, weird way to live for a while. And so he had said, I'd like to have a plan. It's not going to affect how I care about you or what happens with our family, but we have to know what this is going to look like. And so after that, and if I would have said, no, not ready, he would have waited. He would have said, that's fine. I respect that. But knowing that he wanted to kind of get ourselves organized, I finally made the decision to do it.
And so you talk about that decision and going through the genetic testing. And I think we can talk about kind of the results, especially with the title being spared of your memoir. So in getting a negative result, it's a lot of complex emotions, some relief, but some survivor guilt. So, why didn't I get a positive result? Have you processed feeling this spared feeling while others that you know and love were not?
Yeah. Yes. So, spoiler alert, negative test result. The book is called Spared. You don't have to read with bated breath to find out. Although some people was like, oh, I should have realized that, and they were surprised. But it's a little ironic too. Spared question mark almost because you've gone through a lot already. I was 29, I believe, when I got tested. So I've lived 30 years with a lot of things to unpack. And then what happens on the other side? You live a third of your life thinking you're headed one direction, surely. And then what? Now what? supposed to do? And then what do I do with the put off dreams that I wouldn't commit to? And what do I do with this big race I've been in to do everything in my 30s? So I was a mess. I was a hot mess. Had survivor's guilt. I was depressed. I curled up in a ball for a while. Then I felt guilty for feeling guilty. You shouldn't feel guilty for being healthy. What is wrong with you? So then guilt packs on in layers like a winter jacket.
Mhm.
And so it was a funk for a while for sure. What do you do with this information? I remember I called my sister and she had chosen not to test. She also changed her mind about 10 times on whether to test or not. We went through this together and I appreciate her so much because she was truly the only other person on the planet who knew how I felt. But I can remember calling her and telling her, and she said, "Oh, surely I must have it then." And I said to her, "Well, that's not how this works. You know the science. It's 50% for each of us." And I said, "You're a nurse." And she said, "I know. I know all the medical facts. I've got all that in front of me, but that doesn't help my heart." And so right away, she was dealing with that. And my grandmother was thrilled. I was able to call her and she was so happy. And she said, "This is all I ever wanted to hear." And that was beautiful. And I just loved her so much. So people were happy for me. And yet, yeah, why was I spared? Why was dad not spared? Why me? And I'm a person of faith. And so for a long time, my father in law, wonderful, wonderful man. His response was, "God is good." And my head was thinking, well, I don't feel like he's very good right now. He's good to some people, but not good to everybody. And I was in a funk. People say, "How'd you get out of that?" Well, it took some time. Finally started to kind of reemerge. And actually, it was our giving back that started to heal that. Started to get involved in the Huntington's community. We started to help with fundraisers. We actually started a fundraiser that still runs today in our community. And I can remember that survivor's guilt, just rearing its head again as I'm organizing this event. And I had said to my husband, "I don't think I can do this. Like, what right do I even have to be running this event? I'm not sick." And I'll never forget, he said to me, he looked at me and he said, "If the gene negative do not help the gene positive, then who will?" So practical, that man. Well, you have a point there. Okay. So, pull up your pants and get busy. And so then we did. And that I won't lie to you and say that it doesn't rear up once in a while again. When I go to events, especially when I go to events in the HD community, it'll kind of kick up again, but they're a wonderful, non-judgmental community. And everyone who's ever spoken to me says, "I'm so glad that you don't. I'm so glad that you are able to continue giving this message." And one gentleman in particular who was gene positive and is also involved said, "Thanks for not exiting. Thanks for not saying, 'Oh, that's not my problem anymore.'" And so that was good. That was good for the guilt.
Well, I would say that statement of, the gene negative taking care of the gene like that was a very powerful statement to read and then to hear again, recapping that because I think that is so true and it does offer a way to be resilient, but also still say, you know, even if I'm not affected, I'm still a part of the community because like you said, it impacts the family, the
Yes.
caregivers, so many more folks than just that one individual.
Absolutely. And I took some time. I would say to people, there's nothing wrong with taking time. And if you were gene negative and said, "Oh, I've had enough of walking around at risk and seeing my family members pass from this, I need a minute," there's nothing wrong with that either. I think there was a good 3, 4 years after testing negative that I just needed to sit with my life has a new course now. What does that even look like? And then slowly started re engaging and getting involved in the
Right,
community.
right, and taking that break to kind of like you said, there's been this one direction or at least one path you thought your life potentially was taking, and then trying to reorient yourself
Yes,
at that moment.
exactly.
One of the things that I wanted to ask about, because we have a lot of providers and genetic counselors that listen, is what do you think it would be helpful for those on the provider side or even like the research side to better understand about Huntington's disease and about that lived experience?
So many things. Boy, flexibility is key. I think the one thing we found, and my father cycled through 9 adult care homes throughout his life. And that was from the time he went into care. He was in a decade of care before he passed away. And he went to 9 homes in that time. So, I mean, it was a roller coaster of everywhere, and his behaviors did not sit well with a low-key care facility that had maybe 1 or 2 people working there and couldn't manage what was happening. And so probably the time that we found what worked was creativity and flexibility. And the last care facility that actually worked and clicked, I cannot say enough about them, but they led with, "We get pretty creative around here," because I was desperate at that point, and I was working with a social worker, and she was helping me. She was an angel, helping me find places that would take my dad. So when they led with, "We get creative," I said, "Let's talk. Like, we might need a little creativity." There wasn't so much rigor there. He got to be a grown-up. He didn't have a bedtime. He got to eat what he wanted. And so I think, and this is years since, and I don't know what the adult care homes are like now, but I felt like we had a seat at the table to talk about things like bedtime and things about meal prep and that he needed time. They say a person with Huntington's who is decently advanced Huntington's, they need 4 minutes to everyone's 1 minute to formulate an answer when you ask them a question. And I could see it in his face when I would ask him, like, he was just churning. He was thinking about his answer. And then you have to get the words out of your mouth. And he would call me and he would lead with, "Are you my guardian?" When I would pick up the phone. "Yes, I'm your guardian." And then I couldn't understand anything that came after that. It's like he had saved up all of the intro. And so I would pick it apart and, "Oh, can you put the nurse on? Can you put the caretaker on?" And it would be, something was wrong, but you can't say what's wrong. So you're angry, you're frustrated. And then a lot of care facilities were in a hurry. Like, get your clothes on, get in the van, let's go. Anyone in that situation with delayed ability to process and auditory is going to have a meltdown. So I guess that was my thing, is the flexibility. Allow where you can the ability for the person to be an adult, and then take the time to try to just give it a minute for them to process and say what they need to say, if they can say what they need to say. So that last facility was remarkable. They ticked every box there as best they could. And my dad was a difficult case. I heard that so many times. Your dad is a difficult case. And I don't doubt it. And so kudos to anyone that put in the effort to care for him, because I know it wasn't easy. Yeah.
And with some of those facilities, I mean, how hard is it to get folks into those types of facilities? I think you had mentioned your great aunt at the time. With her, it was basically a nursing home. It wasn't necessarily anything that was like specific to people with Huntington's disease. Are
Yes.
there more opportunities for
I feel
that
it's
now?
better now. I really do feel it's better now. I feel if you are a family affected by Huntington's, you need to get yourself to a center of excellence. And they're throughout the United States. The one closest to us, we have one in Madison, Wisconsin, I believe. There's also in Indiana. So you get yourself there, you get yourself connected with a social worker, and you start to explore, because now the website lists facilities that take people that even specialize. I am amazed at how far it's come.
Mhm.
At the
Mm.
time, yeah, we had limited resources. Of course, we wanted him in the least restrictive environment, but that usually involved being in an adult care home. It was all men, and they all had some form of brain injury or mental wellness issue. And my dad couldn't stand noise. And so a lot of his roommates were, pounding on the walls or yelling, or if they couldn't talk, they're frustrated. So they're going to yell, right? And that's super normal. But then he would get agitated because it was loud, and he would start, throwing his walker, and then everything's just.
Right. Yeah, and then it kind of piles on. So I'm wondering too, like because you mentioned it, some of these psychomotor things, like you talked about your father falling on the bleacher and these chorea, which is kind of like dance-like but involuntary movements of the muscle, but then also with the mental weight in terms of like no loud noises or, outbursts at different times. Like you said, you were thinking about Tourette's at some point. What do you wish like the general public understood? Because this is one where I think people can see and sense a lot of things outwardly, but they don't know what's going on inwardly. Not necessarily that you'd want to go like broadcast it to everybody you came in contact with, but is there something that you think people could better understand about families that are at risk for Huntington's disease?
Yeah, so many thoughts there. They have T-shirts now, and this is what Huntington's looks like, and they've got bracelets, and I don't know that my dad would have slapped any of those on, but it would have been great had the greater community known. You see someone in a wheelchair, immediately feel empathy. If you see someone staggering around, you immediately judge. It's just where our minds go. So I would say any sort of neuro illness that causes a distasteful symptom or something, that
Mm.
society would go, "Ooh, what's that?" Somehow we need to create awareness that there's probably something going on inside that is making that person do that. Um, I talk to middle schools. I talk to educators in public schools and as well as the students. And when I talk to the students, I say, when you see something that looks kind of strange, obviously stay safe,
Mhm.
but it doesn't cost anything to smile or to maybe not stare. And we talk about those kind of things about kindness, and you don't know what's happening about the person. And so, yeah, it is really hard to tell what's going on inside of a person. I think now, if people are simply aware that a neurodegenerative illness is killing cells of the brain. And even if you think about that for a minute, if over the period of 25 years your brain is slowly being destroyed, well, no wonder you've lost your faculty. If you're starting to stagger and walk strange, imagine what has been happening decades before. It's no wonder you're having issues with cognition and decision making and inhibition. But the general public wouldn't know. They wouldn't know. Probably the anger was the biggest thing, the angry outbursts. And so now as an adult, I can look back and say, well, no wonder dad was mad. No wonder he just lost it and excessive heat. So HDF people experience this, they're hot. And they're just ripping off their outer layers. They're hot. That would have been awesome to know. So education is key. I think the more we can tell people and share that these things are happening, then the empathy starts to grow. I don't know if I answered your question because I don't know that you would wear the shirt, but I think about education and awareness. Maybe the last thing I'll say is so there are some communities that I've been involved with where family members have notified the police force in the community that, I have a loved one and they like to walk and here's the situation. You're going to see them on, ABC Street and they may look like this and they have Huntington. And I think some of that proactive can make a big difference too. My dad was arrested multiple times, and hadn't been doing anything wrong. So,
Well, and I think like you said too, it's sort of like this local community awareness. So even it's not necessarily I'm gonna wear a shirt and,
right.
go show it to all these people. And I think that was one of the things too in your book is that, it wasn't necessarily talked about. Again, we weren't sure for sure this is what's going on. But that probably also made things a lot harder is that you did live in a smaller town and a closer community that who knows how that would have been handled had it been something at the time that could be named and
Yeah.
brought to light.
I agree. I think language could have made a tremendous difference. A diagnosis would have made a wonderful difference. But you're right. Our family was hunkered down. We were not talking about it. We lived in a small community. And my dad was a man's man. He rode a motorcycle and he was cool. And he was, I think his toughness was his enemy at the end because he didn't want help, didn't think he needed help, didn't need medicine, didn't need doctors, "I'm good. I got this." He did not got this. It was no. And it was a small town. So, yeah, reputation and what are people gonna think and all of that. So, lots of stigma. I think had we talked about it, a lot would have been different. We would have had community services, support, we would have had financial assistance likely. So, I feel like we went it alone and there were consequences for going it alone. You need community when you're struggling.
Yeah. And I think that that's important takeaway too in terms of your getting back into the HD community after kind of taking a break and figuring out, okay, what next? So again, there is something to be said even for those folks that are gene negative about having that community there.
Yeah. Yeah.
One thing I'm curious about, having written a memoir, what has it been like? Even now, I was like, I feel like I know you from the book, but I also don't know you. But how has it been just having people close to you as well as strangers that now know your story? Like, how has that been after putting it all out there?
Yeah, that's wild. It's absolutely wild. I think when I hit print, submit or whatever, I was like, oh boy, there's no taking this out, taking this back now. I'm out there in my skivvies. I would say a couple of things. One is for our family, our internal family. It's been very healing. It was great it was hard read. I had everyone close to me read it before it went to print. I said, if you want to change, edit, add, omit, argue about anything that's going here, if anything has misrepresented or created an undignified whatever, like, let's talk about it. And everyone said, no, go, especially my mother. She said it was very hard to read. Don't change anything. It's all true and it needs to be told. So it's been very healing for our family. So many people have come up to her and said, you're a survivor and you were strong. And I think she struggled with feeling like she hadn't done enough her whole life, feeling like, oh, I didn't do enough for my daughters. And now is hearing a different story back from the public saying, you were very strong. And we were all doing the best we could. To the outer community, boy, the one I remember recently, I was at an HD education day and I had a gentleman stop to my table. And so let me just say, I hate standing at a table, super awkward, but here I am standing at a table. But he came up to me and he said, thank you for writing your book. I felt like you had been looking in our window. And while I would never have wanted someone to go through anything that I went through, we instantly were connected because we had a shared experience. And he felt validated and we were able to talk about it. And so that has been extremely satisfying to know that putting the words out there, they're vulnerable, they're hard, but they created a unity, universal struggle amongst other people. It was validating for people to read. And some of the chapters I hemmed and hawed about, do I put them in? Because I wanted to make sure my father had dignity. And so it was this balance between his dignity and the authenticity. And that gentleman, as we spoke, said, thank you for talking about the hard topics that not everyone talks about with neurodegenerative illness and some of the behaviors that they're happening in every one of these homes, but no one's talking about it.
Right, because
So
like you said, there's a stigma or people are kind of having judgment on them, and so it's hard sometimes, yeah.
So gratifying, good, exhausting, a little terrifying, all of those things. I don't regret that I did it. It is good and it's making a difference.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I had a couple more questions before we wrap up. One was I did wanna know if there's anything you wanted to share about the HD community kind of today, like, what are some things that are either concerns that community has or is facing, or are there
Yeah.
things that they feel are coming that make them feel hopeful? Because, like we said, there is no cure, but there are some ongoing research and clinical trials.
There is absolutely ongoing research, and I will not do this justice because I am not a scientist, but I will do my layman's terms. And what I can tell you is we are on the brink of a major breakthrough, but the community itself is being stalled by FDA regulations. And part of it has to do with the requirement for a sham surgery in order to gain FDA approval for a very expensive brain surgery that could alter an HD person's experience with their life. They are requiring sham surgery. The other piece is not enough data, not enough of a sample size. And what we had hoped was to use all of the enrolled trials, all of the clinical trials people have enrolled in as the sample size. And so they're trying to get, doesn't that count? Isn't that enough data? And of course, the community wants to do it safe. We don't want to just do a crazy, let's go do this experimental brain surgery. But I'm going to be bold because I'm not a scientist and say, if I had HD, well, put me on the table. I'd rather take a scary brain surgery than face what I know I'm going to face. And so I think that's where the community is. They're like, we're standing on the goal line. Let's move this research forward. So you'll hear a lot about Unicure. It's all in the news. There's lots of people going to petition and to talk about it. And they're the real heroes. Yeah, I wrote a book. They're out there petitioning government. So that's a call out to them and help for HD International and HDSA. And oh, here's the other thing. All the different communities of HD have now combined into this effort. So there's quite a bit of unity around all the different agencies.
Okay, and we'll put a link in the show notes so folks can learn more about these efforts.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important and just to be educated and to understand the science behind it. Again, I took that break and when I came back, I'm like, oh, there's some science now. And then so HD Buzz, that's the place to go to learn all the science. It is remarkable how far, but there's so much further to go.
Right, right. And then I think the thing that I'd like to end on is for people that are living at risk for Huntington's disease or their caregivers. What is it that you hope they take away after reading your story or from this conversation? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I would say you are not alone. Absolutely find someone to talk to. Do not hunker down in this isolating illness situation and try to do it by yourself. And today you can log online and get a virtual support group in 30 seconds. If you're a youth who is trying to figure out how do I sort my life, there's a youth organization specifically designed for you with chat rooms and online friends who you're not the only one on the planet going through this. They're out there and you can talk to them. So I would say that start talking about it. I tell people that I speak to, we were not talking about it. We're talking about it now. So don't wait. Get someone to talk to. Find the support you need. Yeah.
And then I would definitely say check out Lori's book Spared if you have not read it yet, because like you had mentioned with that other gentleman, I think it's something that provides a lot of honest insight, but also I'm sure for a lot of folks helps them feel less alone and maybe helps them have that community or start feeling connected.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Lori, for being on the show, for sharing your story and your book, but also these insights with us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
For more information about this episode, visit allaccessdna.podbean.com, where you can also stream all episodes of the show. This link is also in the show notes for easy access. Any inquiries on the podcast can be sent to allaccessdna@gmail.com. Check out our Patreon at patreon.com/allaccessdna and consider donating to get bonus content, submit questions for our guests, and connect with other genetic curious individuals. Note that this podcast is for entertainment and education and is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice. Please consult your physician with any questions you may have regarding your health. Please rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. This helps other people like you discover the show. All Access DNA is hosted, produced, and edited by Kate Wilson. The logo design is by Designs by NKJ. Thanks for listening and join us next time.